Hey, algebra students, welcome to our online remote learning. Trust you guys are enjoying your little extra break that you've had at home and you're ready to start our classes over the internet here. Today's lesson, lesson 66, we're actually going to take this lesson in two different sections here. Today we'll do the first part with a little bit more idea of what we're familiar with, and then tomorrow I'm going to show you how to solve these polynomial equations using a method that we haven't quite used before, so we'll look at how do we correctly do that together. Let's go ahead and get started right into our lesson today. How do we correctly solve a polynomial equation? Well, first of all, let's define what is a polynomial equation. If you remember in math, simply a polynomial is an algebraic expression. What does it mean that something is algebraic? It has variables. That's what it has to have in order for it to be considered algebraic. So these different equations that we'll be looking at are some different equations that involve our variables, and our job is to figure out the value of each of the variables that we have in the question. The method that we'll be following here this morning in order to solve these polynomial equations is going to be to factor. Remember, to factor, one of the keys that you have to do first is set your equation equal to 0. With factoring, you're either looking for a common factor, something that you can pull out to the front, or you're going to see if you can break your question into two different parentheses. We'll see both of those as we're working through our different examples here in a few minutes. Now, after you factor, you're then going to apply what's called the zero product property. If you remember, the word product means a multiplication question. Well, that's what you just did when you factored. You wrote the question as a multiplication problem, and you said that this multiplication question equals 0. Well, what's the only way in math that you can multiply and get 0 for your final answer? One of the original pieces has to be 0. So here's what the zero product property says. It says if A, B, those are my factors, whether they be polynomials, whether they just be a single term, if A times B equals 0, then one of those two factors, either the A or the B, has to be equal to our 0. Let me just go through a review question with you first, and that way just get our minds thinking along the right track, and then we'll work through some of the questions that we'll see for our lesson 66 today. If I had asked you to solve x squared plus 5x plus 6 equals 0. Notice this equation is already set equal to 0, so we didn't have to worry about that first step. We can go right into our factoring method. X squared, 5x, and 6 do not have something all in common, so I can't pull anything out to the front, but we can break this down into two different parentheses. Remember, the plus at the end tells me the signs are going to be the same, and then that plus in the middle tells me they're both going to be positive signs inside of our binomial parentheses. To find the numbers that we're going to fill in, our key question, what did we multiply to get a 6? Well, at the same time, we added them together to get a 5. What would those numbers be? 2 and 3. So I factored our expression as x plus 2 times x plus 3 is equal to 0. And those parentheses can come in either order. That doesn't matter at all. Notice what you've done is you've written your question as a multiplication problem that is equal to 0. Why is that helpful? Because the only way that you can multiply and get 0 is if one of those original pieces is 0. So I'm going to go ahead and split up our question like that. I said x plus 2 equals 0, or I can also write x plus 3 equals 0. One of those two equations has to be true in order for that previous factors to be true in our question. Both of those equations will require me to subtract to get x by itself. The first equation, if I subtract 2, will give me negative 2, and the second equation, if I subtract 3, will give me our second possibility of negative 3. If I did substitute those two back into the original equation one at a time, I would see that that would give me a true answer. Notice there's two answers because we do have the x squared, and that usually keys us as to how many total answers that we have in our question. So that's our goal in our lesson today. We're going to try to factor. Based on the factors, we can come up with what are the different answers that we see for x in our question. So let's go ahead and work through some of the newer kind of questions that we'll see in our lesson. So the first one, 2x to the 4th minus 10x to the 3rd minus 72x squared equals 0. The first step has already been taken care of for us. The equation is set equal to 0, so we can move right into the factoring process. Now on this question, we do have a common factor that we can pull out to the front first. Beginning with those numbers, 2, 10, and 72. 2, 10, and 72 all divide by 2, so that's something that I can move out to the front. Also with the variables, x to the fourth, x to the third, and x squared. Every single term does contain a variable, which means there's something that they have in common. When it came to factoring, we always took out the one that had the smallest exponent, so I'm going to take out the x squared. So the first thing in my question is I'm going to pull out that 2x squared for our common factor. What I have inside the parentheses is what still remains if I take out the 2x squared. So 2 divided by 2 gave me 1. I didn't write that down. I could have if I wanted to. I had 4 letter x's. I took out 2 of them, so I had 2 x's or my x squared. I dropped down the minus sign. 10 divided by 2 gave me 5. We had 3 x's. We took out 2 of them, and that left me with 1 letter x there. Bring down the minus. 72 divided by 2 is 36. The original question had 2 x's there, but we took out 2 x's, so there's no x's left with that 36 at the end of the parenthesis. Notice what you have inside the parenthesis now looks very similar to what we just saw in our previous question. It has an x squared, and that's something that usually we can break down into our 2 parentheses. Now, don't forget that common factor still needs to move down to the front. On this question, the last sign that I see was a minus. When the last sign was a minus, that clued us that the signs were going to be different inside of our parentheses. One of them had to be a plus, and then one of them had to be a minus. What numbers did I need to multiply to get our 36 and to add together to get a -5? It would be our +4 and our -9. So that's how I correctly filled in our parentheses. Now, once I have those answers inside the question, I can go ahead and fill in the final answers for our question. We have 3 different parts of our multiplication problem. The first one being the 2x squared, the second one being the x plus 4, and the last one being the x minus 9. Now, there was a little kind of shortcut that I had showed you during class about how I could pick out the final answers for these questions. If you remember, the answers were always the opposite of what we saw inside the parenthesis, as long as it started off with x, like the 2 parentheses that we see up here on the screen. Now, the first part of the question, though, 2x squared doesn't have a parenthesis, so there's nothing being added or subtracted. So what does that mean? The first answer is going to give us is going to be 0. There was nothing being added or subtracted. The second parenthesis says x plus 4, so if I pick the opposite, I would have -4, and then x minus 9, again, picking the opposite would be +9. We have 0, -4, and 9 as the 3 answers in our question. Now, you may be thinking, well, I thought I saw an x to the 4th, so why aren't there 4 answers on this question? We'll be talking about this word here in a few minutes, about why are there only 3 answers, but I do see an x to the 4th. If you looked at the beginning of the question or the beginning of our factors where it says 2x squared, well, that gave us the answer of 0. Well, that x was being squared, so that kind of takes care of 2 of the answers. And then I have one of them from the x plus 4 parenthesis and the other from x minus 9. Again, I'll tell you what that's called in a few minutes as we continue into our notes. Let's work through a few more of these questions together that you'll be doing for your homework tonight from your textbook. The next equation that we're going to try to solve, x to the 3rd minus 12x is equal to x squared. Now notice this question, unlike the other 2 that we've done so far, is not set equal to 0. So that we're going to have to do first. To get this set equal to 0, I'm going to subtract the x squared over to the left-hand side. Now, when I subtract it to the left-hand side, I want to put my terms in order from the highest exponent down to the lowest exponent. So there's my x to the 3rd, then my minus x squared, my minus 12x that was there already, and it's equal to 0. We're now ready to factor, where a common factor always comes first if we can. There is no common number this time because in front of those first 2 terms, I really just have a 1. So I can't pull anything for the numbers, but I can take out something when it comes to the variable because they do all contain an x. Again, for the variable, we're taking out the one that had the smallest exponent, and that would be the letter x. So factoring that out, my x is in the front, and that would leave us with x squared minus x minus 12, and our equation still equals 0. Your parenthesis now does have your x squared, which we can try to break down into 2 different parentheses, and I've done that for us. Don't forget the x still stays in the front as your common factor. The 2 signs that I have inside of my parentheses are different because of the minus that I saw in the 12, and then the numbers that multiplied to give the 12, and I can add them together to get the -1 that's on the middle term, are +3 and -4. Notice we have 3 different parts of our multiplication problem, so there's 3 different answers that we're going to give. Again, the answers are usually the opposites of what we see inside of the parenthesis. The first factor of x, well, the x isn't inside of a parenthesis, so what number does it go with? The number 0. The second parenthesis, x plus 3, so I'm going to do the opposite of negative 3. The last parenthesis, x minus 4, I'm going to give the opposite of positive 4 in your question. Now, remember, you could write it out like I showed you on the first question. You would take each of those factors individually and set them equal to 0. So I could say x equals 0. Well, that's already my first answer. Then I could say x plus 3 equals 0. That would require me to subtract 3. There's my second answer, that x was negative 3. And then the last one, x minus 4 equals 0. And I could add 4, and there's the last answer that we have in the question. So it doesn't matter which way you set it up, using the shortcut or writing each of your questions individually out. Notice the question did have an x to the third, and that clues us that we're probably going to have 3 answers, and I do have 3 different answers on this question. Now, going back to that concept that I told you, where one of the answers shows up multiple times because of the exponent that's on that, what that's called is a multiplicity of root. Now, the word root just means it's the answer in your question. So the answer shows up multiple times. I think there should be 4 answers, but I really only got 3 because one of them repeated twice. Or I think there should be 5 answers, but I only got 2 answers because something repeats in our question. So this is what our textbook says about multiplicity. The multiplicity of a root r, so that's of a certain answer, of your original equation. It's the number of times a certain factor shows up in the question. The factors are the parentheses. The factors are the things that you pulled out to the front first in your equation. I have 3 different questions that we'll work through here to understand this idea of multiplicity, and I'll explain as to how you can pick out how many answers a certain question is going to have. Let's begin with x squared plus 4x plus 4 is equal to 0. The equation is already set equal to 0, so I don't need to worry about that step in this question. There is no common factor between x squared, 4x, and 4, so I'm going to go ahead and try to break this up into 2 parentheses. I know inside of my 2 parentheses, the signs are going to be the same because of the plus at the end, and the 2 signs would be positive because of the plus that I have in the middle of our question. What can I multiply to get 4 and also add together to get 4? It would be 2 and 2. So I have an x plus 2 and an x plus 2 is equal to 0. So if I were to set up my 2 different equations, the first equation says x plus 2 equals 0. Well, the second equation also says x plus 2 equals 0. Those 2 equations are exactly the same. They showed up multiple times. That's this idea of multiplicity. Both of these equations to solve would require me to subtract 2, so I get the exact same answer. So what that's called, the root or my answer at negative 2 appear twice. It's called a double root because double means twice there, and it has a multiplicity of 2. I would have known that as I started off with my factors because my 2 parentheses were identical when I broke it down into x plus 2 times x plus 2. So we'll carry that idea of multiplicity into our next 2 examples. I'm going to go and stop this video and start a next one, so please make sure that you do continue to watch continuation of part 1 of lesson 66 for the next couple examples about multiplicity.